Acts 17:6 says that when Paul came to Athens, which must have been a dream fulfilled for someone who was educated in Greek philosophy and culture, when Paul arrived, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. It broke his heart to see the idolatry and the paganism. But then Acts 17:22-24 says that Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, "Men of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' Now what you worship as something unknown, I am going to proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth and does not live in temples built by human hands." Now, I kind of gasp at what St. Paul there did. I kind of gasp and try to imagine myself standing before a group of pagans who didn't believe anything that I believe about Orthodox Christianity and complimenting them on how religious they were. It's not something I would feel all that comfortable doing, but even less comfortable on what he next did. He says, "This unknown pagan God that you worship, I'll tell you who he is. He's the God who created the heavens and the earth." And then he goes on to quote two pagan poets, when it seems to me I would have preferred him to quote one of the Old Testament prophets instead. But what he was doing was contextualizing. He was speaking their language. He was reaching them where they were. He describes this philosophy in 1 Corinthians 9 when he says, "I become all things to all persons in order to save some." Ministering contextually is what we heard about in the Church of the Resurrection in Washington. It is example after example in the sheets that are here on the seats about reaching apartment dwellers. It is recognizing where people are and then our adapting and adjusting in order to save them. It is not a compromise of biblical Orthodox Christianity, but it is always adapting to our audience to make the message clear and comprehensible. I, for many years, have taught in a variety of seminaries, and in order to practically communicate this concept to doctoral students, I have them do an exercise that I would love to do with you, but dare not do right now. But it goes something like this. In the classroom, I have all of the students divide up in pairs, and I tell them that they are to tell the story of Noah and the ark to the other student in the pair, with the storyteller's back to me and the listener facing to the front of the classroom. And then I throw in one other piece, and that is, I say that I'm going to write on the whiteboard a number, and if you are the listener to the telling of the story, this is the age that you are to behave while the story is being told. Although the storyteller doesn't get to see the number that's on the board. First time through it, I write the number 5. And then we switch, and the second time through it, I write the number 15. And it is just a delightful bit of fun to watch what then happens. And now we've got, these are doctoral students who are behaving like 5-year-olds. And I'm up front taking all of this in. I've seen them put their heads down on the desk and sleep. I have watched one of them sit there and pick his nose all the way through the entire story of Noah and the ark. I've watched one get up and leave and go to the bathroom. And one of the most memorable, I can hardly, if you saw the people, you would gasp all the more. He actually got up and went and sat on the lap of this other doctoral candidate and stroked his hair all the way through the story. And then they switch. And now the listener is a 15-year-old. Of course, the storyteller doesn't know how old this person is. And sometimes the 15-year-old just sits and stares, or sometimes asks philosophical questions, like, was there a unicorn on the ark? And others put on their iPod and just crank it up while the story is being told. One of my favorites was watching while one of these doctoral students, listening to the story of Noah and the ark, took out his cell phone and called another student on the other side of the room, and they just talked back and forth while people were trying to explain about Noah and his ark. Now, the point of this exercise is that you tell a story differently to a 5-year-old than to a 15-year-old. And while the story may stay the same, it needs to be adapted to the audience that is listening. In other words, contextual ministry. We do what Jesus did. We look at who the audience is, and then we communicate in a way that is effective to that audience. And how does all this relate to being a first century church in our 21st century America? Well, there is a new traditionalism in America. So just as Paul dealt with traditional Jews, we deal with traditional people in our generation. There are millions of Americans who yearn to connect to the long history of the Holy Catholic Church. They are weary of narcissistic individualism, and they grieve the losses that have come with the lack of liturgy. So I quote to you an article you may have seen, the last issue in 2007 of U.S. News and World Report, where this was a cover story. One of those paragraphs says, put simply, the development is a return to tradition and orthodoxy, to past practices, observances, and customary ways of worshiping. But it is not simply a return to the past, at least not in all cases. Even while drawing on deep traditional resources, many participants are creating something new within the old forms. They are engaging in what Penn State sociologist of religion Roger Finke calls innovative returns to worship. That is to say that we have a younger generation to reach for Jesus Christ. That is, by the way, those that are roughly 12 to 22 years old, part of a generation larger than any other in American history, more of them than there are of baby boomers. And they are a generation that is looking back in order to see forward. But they seek tradition that is better than it used to be. So what they do is they want a McDonald's that is like the 1950 McDonald's, an architecture of a half century ago. They want a McDonald's that has Elvis Presley and James Dean and Peggy Sue and poodle skirts. But they also want Diet Coke and Chicken McNuggets and a drive-thru. So it's yesterday's tradition, only it's better and it's different. Yeah, they want a Mustang that looks like the 1960s and 70s. They want a retro style of car like the PT Cruiser, as long as it has airbags and electric windows and an FM radio and all of the things for today. It's retro, but it's today's retro. They want phones that look like they're from 1922, as long as they have call waiting and call forwarding and touch tone. So it is yesterday, only better. Tradition, better than it ever was before. At the same time, in this ministering to our 21st century context, there is, I think, a new paganism in America. So that means that there are all kinds of people who have never been to church. I talked to one University of Minnesota student who said, I was repeatedly invited to a campus Bible study, and I didn't go because I was afraid someone would use technical terminology, like Easter. And she said, I had no idea what Easter was or what it meant, so I repeatedly said no to going to the campus Bible study. So we have a new paganism in America in the sense that these are people who are totally biblically illiterate, who have no sense of tradition or of, yesterday. And it means that to reach them, we have to speak their language. We have to connect on MySpace. We have to hang out at Starbucks. We have to use the language as Paul did on Mars Hill that contextualizes to them and their generation. Like Paul, we need to become all things to all persons in order to save some. Our 21st century American context adds another amazing ingredient for our churches to be effective in this generation, and that is immigration to America. Now, I'll just ask you for a few moments here to set aside whatever your political persuasion is concerning how America ought to politically deal with issues of immigration, and simply put on our Christian ears and think of immigration in terms of the 21st century of Jesus Christ. America has become, in the generation in this room and the generation before, the largest missionary sending country in the history of Christianity. So there is virtually no place that you can go in the world where there is not or has not been American Christian missionaries expanding or establishing the Church of Jesus Christ. Some have interestingly said, we used to send missionaries from America to the mission fields around the world, but now through immigration, the mission fields of the world have come to America. I think that is a very incomplete picture. In fact, it may be more accurate to say that the missionaries have come to us, that it's actually a reversal of the way we may typically see it. For what we have happening in the world today, especially in the global south, is the explosive growth of the Church of Jesus Christ. In Africa and Asia and Latin America, it is nothing short of supernatural. Africa in our lifetime has become a majority Christian continent south of the Sahara Desert. South America is being transformed from a Roman Catholic continent to a Pentecostal Protestant continent. And China is quickly on its way to becoming the largest Christian country in the world, the largest Christian country in all of history. And what is amazing is that so many of the immigrants to America have come from the places where the gospel and the Church of Jesus Christ are spreading like wildfire. And they're coming to America and establishing churches and sending missionaries and changing America for future generations. Indeed, the missionaries have come to America, and the influence will be long. So blessed are those American churches that embrace new immigrants, and blessed are those churches that catch the spiritual wildfire that comes from other places around the globe.